All right. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Jess. I'm going to be the moderator for this debate. Our topic is a little bit different than the other debates that we've seen so far in this class because ours is a little more broad. So, our question is, when it comes to caring for and protecting children, where do we draw that line between parental rights and government intervention? So, this ethical dilemma is seen in several examples from refusing medical treatment on the basis of religion, leaving children alone in cars to run into the store, choices of education for children. It can go on and on. Uh, our question centers on where do parental rights end and community responsibility begin? So, Ella is arguing the side of government and community intervention, and John is arguing on the side of parental rights. So, we can go ahead and get started with Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella. I'll be arguing again the side of um, government. Um, in on my side, the thesis is that parental rights need to be limited when they conflict with the child's rights to safety, health, and development. The state and community have moral and legal obligations to intervene when parent decisions cross into neglect or abuse, regardless of the context. Um, this is because children's rights have to subsede or supersede parental autonomy. We see this with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It recognizes children as individuals with rights, not merely extensions of their parents. Children have the right to participate in decisions affecting their lives, and best interests of the child is a standard that is internationally accepted and used in U.S. doctrine. Um, Defining the boundary between parenting and neglect, according to Missouri law, neglect is the failure to provide care necessary to maintain physical and mental health when such failure presents a substantial probability of harm. That would be like, for example, medical neglect. If someone is like refusing their child life-saving treatment, like a blood transfusion, um, and one example that's maybe like relevant to today would be maybe a vaccine that might potentially save that child's life in the future, or like not using seat belts or other basic safety measures in a car. Abuse and neglect aren't subjective parenting styles, they're legally and ethically defined failures to protect children. Parental autonomy can't justify harm. Parents can act in what they believe are their child's best interests, but that doesn't extend to decisions that cause foreseeable harm. And courts consistently rule that parental rights end where child endangerment begins. The state has a duty to intervene before harm becomes irreversible. Um, Age and development also affect a child's ability to consent or understand risk. So risk has to be assessed not only in terms of immediate danger, but also long-term developmental impact. Like chronic neglect can impair cognitive, emotional, and physical development. So failure to intervene early can result in lifelong harm. Um, in conclusion, parental rights are not absolute when they conflict with a child's right to safety, their development, or their health, and intervention is not only justified, it's necessary. While enforcement should be equitable and non-punitive, the core principle remains protecting children has to come before preserving parental autonomy. I'd like to
Well,
pass it off to John.
well, Ella, I think that you made an excellent point, but I think that I noticed maybe a few flaws in your argument. And I think that most people who are arguing for parental rights will agree that parents should always center the rights and responsibilities and just the autonomy of children. Again, is there a situation where if there's life-saving, like life-threatening illness for a child should have access to whatever they need. But the problem with it in the idea of neglect, it's very vaguely defined. And one of the issues that come along, especially in the research that I saw, was basically that child neglect laws are vaguely defined, which allows states to determine what constitutes neglect, right? So there have been numerous incidents of children being hotlined by Child Protective Services based off conscious decisions that parents are making. So a parent may make the decision that my child who is 9 years old is old enough to walk to school. My child who is 7 years old is old enough to play at the park by themselves. My child who is 8 years old is old enough to make dinner for themselves or old enough to watch their older children, right? We mention neglect, but neglect is basically the idea of whatever the states defines as neglect, right? And then whenever neglect is mentioned, parents can actually lose their rights to their children, can lose supervision to their children, and may be forced to engage in numerous activities to be able to see their child, right? And then if we mention the idea of neglect, we also have to mention like the racial and social economic like bias that's present in that. Or again, where people of color and children of color often are hotlined by Child Protective Services for the sole purpose of states and people in their community recognizing that this child may not be old enough to do whatever activity that they're engaging in. But then again, the idea of neglect should actually talk about like what actually is bringing harm to that child. And I think that the article that was reaching also mentions that parents have a right to determine a child's levels of independence. Um, but basically, the right is only provided to parents who are considered fit, right? So basically, the idea of what makes someone a fit parent is determined by each individual state. But every state basically also comes in agreement that when a parent isn't fit, they lose their parental rights. But big states like Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, Connecticut, Illinois, Montana, Florida, and Missouri have reasonable childhood independence laws, which, and I think Missouri is a really good example because, again, it actually defines what neglect is and actually puts protection in place for parents, basically saying that child have parents have the idea of have the right to basically instill independence in their children and the fact that they can't be tried and they can't be sanctioned by the state, can't be sanctioned by courts for allowing their child to be independent. And again, neglect can extend more beyond just having your child be independent, obviously, not feeding them, not providing for their needs, not giving them medical treatment. That all constitute neglect, and I am not disagreeing with you at all. But the important part is neglect is so vaguely defined that again, it has long-lasting impacts. We also have to be idea of what neglect actually means for different states. So we mentioned the idea of just independence for some states. We also have to think about the consequences for what happens when states actually take a more proactive stance and the negative consequences of that. So states like Alabama have failure to protect laws, which basically states that a parent can actually be tried and caregivers can actually be tried with child abuse because again, they may be aware of abuse that a child is like experiencing and they may not come to police. And in theory, that sounds like an amazing idea. Like you are aware of abuse. Us as social workers are mandated reporters, and then we have to consciously keep people informed and actually make sure that we actually hotline cases like that. But what happens if you're a single mother in a domestic violence situation, where if you're being physically abused, sexually abused, psychologically abused, and your child is also being abused? If you come to the police, or if a child goes to the hospital, a lot of times you are considered more culpable than the actual abuser because you are aware of the abuse that a child is suffering. And then we also have to mention the actual like the sexism aspect of it, where a lot of times these failure to protect laws actually punish women a lot more than men because again, women are put in this nurturing role. So a lot of times that women who are in domestic violence situations face stricter punishments because again, we feel like mothers fail their children, despite the fact that like these laws are put in place basically to instill punitive punishment. But the failure of punitive punishment is the fact that it essentially puts a black and white filter on all things if anything happens to a child. And we also have to think about what are the impacts of a parent who may lose access to their child due to like what is it, failure to protect laws, due to neglect laws, and due to poverty. I saw an article based on the Human Rights Watch talking about how being poor can actually get you more likely to be involved with child protective services. And when you're involved with child protective services, they have broad discretion to take your child away from you. And a lot of times we put artificial barriers in place to parents for being poor, for being living in impoverished neighborhoods, for for anything that we view as outside the norm. So the idea of protecting children is amazing, and I 100% agree with that. But the problem with that is the fact that protecting, neglect, these terms are all vaguely defined. So there are long-lasting consequences, and unfortunately, those consequences aren't distributed equally.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is your general argument is on the definition of neglect and the ways in which it's applied unequitably. And I honestly, I would like to argue that the debate itself that we're arguing is maybe a poor debate because it's not really a question of protecting parents from trouble or protecting children from harm because everyone's on the same side. We all want to protect children from harm. So I think really the argument is the debate is maybe a little bit flawed in that we really should be considering how are we dealing with neglect and the neglect cases because I think we can both agree that regardless of the definition of neglect, these punitive punishments are having like bad effects on the ways in which we are protecting children from neglect. So, like a parent who chooses to have their kid go play on the playground because they're 9 years old, and someone sees it, and because the kid is black, the kid ends up getting taken away from their home or something. Those kinds of things aren't effective ways of protecting children. So I think maybe we need to focus on, um, instead of weakening child welfare standards, strengthen support systems, reduce punitive responses, focus on prevention, so housing, food security, access to healthcare, non-carceral interventions like family support services, education, community-based care, and shift the narrative from like protecting parents from trouble and protecting children from harm to like a more cohesive, community based kind of thought process.
I think that an important thing that I want to also hit on the fact that, yes, having access to more community resources are important, but the problem is sometimes those community resources may be the problem. Where I mentioned with social services, child protective services, those are community resources designed to protect children. And the theory of them is providing additional levels of support. But the problem is we have to see how that's actually implemented. Because again, what happens if Child Protective Services comes to a low income family and says, hey, you tested positive for marijuana. You have to do drug treatment courses. You have to do group therapy. You have to engage in coping skills so and so times per week, right? We recognize that interventions like that do not actually positively impact the life of a mother, life of a father, and the life of the children because that puts artificial roadblocks. Where again, a lot of times when you're involved with child protective services, there's an element of poverty there that you are more likely to be a person of color. And since you are a person of color and since you are a lower socioeconomic status, you have lower access to resources to begin with. So what happens if you have to do drug court on the other side of town, but you also have to work? And that compounds that aspect of poverty. Where again, if you only have enough gas money to get to work and pick up your kid from school, but you have to do drug training courses. And a lot of times, in a lot of these articles, they mention the fact that a lot of times we like to put parents on edge. Again, we get them access to community resources, but there are numerous strings attached where you apply for WIC, but if you test positive for drugs, you may not be eligible. You benefit from SNAP benefits, but if you have a previous drug charge, you may not be eligible for these services. I think an important thing that we also need to mention is the fact that we just need easier access for community resources as a whole. Parents or not parents, we need easier ways to actually get out of domestic violence situations. We need we need more child protections, which is incredibly important, but we also have to see how that's actually implemented and have that ability to change laws as they go along. Because again, the problem that a lot of things happen is the fact that we have laws on the books and these laws never get taken off the books. So a lot of times, if you are a parent who tests positive for drugs and may be pregnant, that's actually like you in most states that may not be illegal. But then again, what happens if there's child endangerment laws and they say that, hey, you're actually endangering your child by using drugs while you're pregnant? I think that's the important thing. But I also still agree with you 100% about the fact that we are kind of in the we are kind of still in that both in agreement that these laws are incredibly important and that we're not disagreeing, but we're kind of curious about how this is implemented and how are we going to actually center these topics.
I agree. I do think we really need to focus on, um, getting the people who are actually affected and the people who are part of the community to have resources that actually work for them instead of being like a threat to their way of living, and a threat to their functioning. Like you mentioned, with people having to go across town to like get a drug test, that's not an effective intervention. Um, so yeah, I would agree with that. I think, yeah, we need to focus not necessarily on um like what neg or like neglect itself as like is it parental rights versus neglect, but how can we better support our parents and our communities?
Yes.
Okay, guys, that was a really great discussion. Um, I feel like we hit a lot on, everybody wants children to be safe, everybody wants kids to be healthy. But how do we take these programs that are in place for that purpose and make sure that they're actually hitting that mark instead of putting more children in foster care and parents in carceral situations? So I think I think that was great. Does anybody have anything else to add?
I believe so. No.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you.